Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be talking about this topic, which indeed I've been studying, well, for about 20 years now. I've always studied the business response to climate change. Climate change, back in the day, we talked a lot about the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997, and to see, okay, how are companies now looking at climate change and how are going to change what they're doing? Well, having studied this for 20 years, I have to say, yeah, it had its ups and downs. So they weren't always doing what we were hoping for. There have been a lot of initiatives and there's been a lot of progress. If we look at the energy system, for example, renewables are now part and parcel of everything we do. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. So there's been a lot of success. But there's also been a bit of a disappointment at times. So you might remember in the 2000s, around 2006, 2007, there was a lot of buzz around climate change with Al Gore and his movie Inconvenient Truth, won a Nobel Prize even. And we all really thought, oh, now we're really going to change our industry, our economy, and become low carbon. It didn't really happen because you might remember back then we had a crisis as well, the global financial crisis. And a lot of the ideas then were also to come up with a green recovery to get through the crisis in a better way. You had programs like Cash for Clunkers because a lot of focus was on car companies because they were nearly going bankrupt. So how could you basically get the car companies out of bankruptcy and at the same time push them to become greener? So a lot of money was poured into developing electric vehicles. Looking back now, some of it might have worked because now electric vehicles are a lot more there. But still at the same time, the attention for climate change disappeared more or less. Then we became optimistic again with the Paris Agreement, 2015, and everything, oh, it's going to happen again. And the whole debate then became about net zero and how net zero goals are very important, that you can kind of reduce your own emissions at a certain level, and what you can't reduce, you offset that. That's the net. You do tree planting schemes, for example, and then the trees are supposed to absorb the CO2. Or you do carbon capture, usage and storage, where you capture the carbon and put it underground, or you use it in industrial applications. And here you saw that things were moving again. And then you got the whole development of Greta Thunberg with the school movement. But then we got another crisis. Then we got the COVID crisis. So we really thought now climate change is the most important thing. But the next crisis came along. And many of us working in this field thought, okay, here we go again. We've been there before. Huh? The Al Gore effect, the Greta Thunberg effect, will it be the same that it dies out? Well, the good thing was it didn't. Actually, it stayed on the agenda. And it was actually being used as kind of thinking about how do we want to get through and out of the COVID crisis. Because the COVID crisis was not just a health crisis. Of course, there was a socioeconomic crisis as well. GDP really plunged in many countries. So something needed to be done. And there was this idea, actually, we can use the money we put into the economy to recover in the area of green technology, green developments, and behavioral change, for example, that we change our mobility. So we try to then understand as researchers, what does it then mean in practice? So these governments that were pushing for a green recovery, what were they putting their money in? So we did a piece of research together with Frank Gils and Guillermo Pereira for the Productivity Institute, which is also part of the Alliance Manchester Business School, to try and see, okay, looking at 3 countries, in this case, the UK, France, and Germany, that were considered leaders in green recovery funding, what did they actually spend their money on? And we tried to do that comparison. And as you probably already feel it coming, some of it was maybe a little bit disappointing. Yes, there was a lot of money, but there was a lot of debate also about, well, is it all new money? There was a lot of relabeling existing pots of money. But still, it was quite extraordinary to see how much governments were now willing to spend on green sectors. And in our research, we found that there were mainly 4 parts of the economy that were being pushed with the green recovery. And those were hydrogen, and that is to do with big industry, the so-called hard to decarbonize sectors, steel, chemicals, cement companies. They want to see if they can use hydrogen as an alternative for using fossil fuels. A lot of it was going into mobility, all electric vehicles, infrastructure related to that. Then part of it was all going into housing and retrofits, especially in the UK. This is a very big problem. A lot of the houses are leaking energy everywhere. So you need to somehow make those houses more energy efficient. And that's what's considered very attractive, because that means a lot of people can get jobs out of that. It needs a lot of people. And then finally, there was a push also for railways to really improve the infrastructure. Again, in the UK, that was also linked, for example, to the leveling up agenda. We are here in the north, and we know that the railway is not always perfect, if I put it mildly. So looking across the three countries and these four sectors, we try to then understand how are they different, what are they going for, and what are the ultimate aims. And what we saw was that a green recovery is about two things. It's about green, but it's also about recovery. What is it that you try to do? What is it that you try to push? And in the UK, a lot of it has been about jobs, because the UK did not have, like the two other countries, a big program, integrated program, but it was more a plan for jobs. And then you had the 10-point plan. But in the end, a lot of it was then about trying to create jobs. So a lot of money was pushed into the housing sector. And that became the famous Green Homes Grant, which was then scrapped after 6 months because of all kinds of transactional problems and so forth. So because of that, in the UK, the feeling that the biggest part of the green recovery, the housing, the retrofits, it didn't work out in the end. So does that mean there should not be a green recovery, that it didn't work? No, it probably will come back in a different shape and form. But in the end, the green recovery is then about these different parts. It's about how we're going to change mobility in the country, how we're going to change what we do with industry, and really also our own behavior. What is it that we're going to do? Are we willing to change as consumers, as customers? Though there are still many questions there, because certain paths have been set out. We can see where specific kind of investments might be going. But one of the questions is it really new? Is it really pushing us in a new direction? And also, is there the possibility to do so? When we had the first lockdown, there was a big belief that things would all change now. And we could now we've wiped the slate clean and we can develop in a new direction. We now know that it's not that easy. A lot of the developments, new directions, are based on what was happening before, of course. So if you look at hydrogen, for example, in France and Germany, they already had an existing hydrogen strategy. So what they were pushing as part of the green recovery was linked to that strategy. In the UK, the hydrogen strategy had not yet been published. That happened after the green recovery package. So there it was more questionable what is going to happen in the field of hydrogen. So in the end, looking at green recovery is not just something completely new. It is all linked to long histories of trying to change our transport system, long histories of trying to upgrade the energy efficiency of our buildings and houses. It's just that it got a stronger push now. But a lot of the problems that we've seen before in trying to do that have not suddenly disappeared. It's not the case that now all construction companies are super enthusiastic to change everything they do because they only want to become net zero now. There is still a lot of resistance as well. And this is what we need to study and what we need to try and understand better. Why is that the case? What is holding them back? And who then should push whom in what way? So this was the starting point, basically, for us to just have an overview of what is happening. But the story about the green recovery is technically only starting now because we're only just slowly recovering. And then we have to see how green can play a role. So Jim, you have some questions for me. So
I do. I certainly have, and I certainly hope the audience will ask questions too. I think just starting off with that particular piece of work, Jonatan, you talked about there, which was extremely timely and relevant. Just tell us why you chose as well to compare UK with France and Germany. Why was that?
We wanted to focus, well, first it had to be about the UK because it was funded by the Productivity Institute, which focuses on UK productivity. And then we tried to look for other countries that were of similar structure and size, but also really had the ambition to have a green recovery. So the clear candidates were Germany and France, because they are some of the biggest economies in the EU, but also were very vocal about, we want to use this crisis as an opportunity to change and to green our economy. So in terms of their ambition, all three countries were very similar. In terms of how they were actually implementing it, there were differences, but also there are a lot of similarities. So a lot of the kind of criticism, for example, that we've heard in the UK, like, oh, this is just relabeling money and so forth. Germany had exactly the same kind of debate. There was a lot of relabeling there as well. France, the same thing. So in the end, they were all following a very similar trajectory, but we wanted to get into the nuance of it then. Where is it then different? And that led to a lot of more detailed analysis, and we could see differences. They had maybe similar goals, but the actual plans to implement those goals were quite different.
One of the key things that came out of your research in the paper was this issue around new policies or new programs and the debate there. You really touched on before that where you're sort of working on existing programs, there was perhaps some slightly more success initially, or has been perhaps, than those where you're trying to create new programs. And we saw that here in the UK with the Green Homes Grant and the issues that had. Just tell us a bit about that sort of dynamic, the fact that is it easier or better, should we say, to actually reevaluate existing programs and rather than actually go for something completely new? And also because the timings, how long we've got to create new programs. Just tell us about that issue.
Yeah. So when a green recovery builds on something that was already happening, you can do the implementation much faster because you have everything already in place. That was in Germany, for example, with the whole building retrofits. They had all kinds of existing programs. So the actual recovery money was just extra funding for these existing programs. While in the UK, it had to be this new Green Homes Grant. And well, maybe that has become, there's been maybe too much emphasis on that, but this is where you see the problems. It is not that easy to allocate a lot of money to a sector that is so kind of differentiated. There's so many little companies there. They have to all find out, how could I get this money? What are the procedures? How does it all work? So the transaction costs can be very, very high. And this is where you typically see policy learning over time. When such programs have been in place before and they've been improved over time, then it's much easier to pour more money into it because we then already know how to allocate the money across the sector. That wasn't the case here. And people working in that field already said at the time, this is not going to work, because they knew the structural problems in the industry and the amount of paperwork needed for this program. Still, it took some time to become successful, but when it was scrapped, there were actually quite a lot of people going for the grant. So it has become a political issue if it wasn't scrapped too fast. But the downside of working really and basing things on existing programs is that you're more or less still doing what you used to do. And maybe it wasn't ambitious enough. And this can really be the problem more. And in academic terms, we call that path dependency, that it's too much depending on what you did in the past. And that what you did in the past is driving also what you're going to do in the future, while the goal needs to change. Climate change, the net zero goal, needs to now be central. While a lot of the policies back in the day in a lot of these sectors did not put climate change central. They were there for all kinds of other reasons. So that makes it tricky at times when you are going for the lazy mode and basically say, okay, we're just putting some extra money in existing programs.
Is this in part now driven by short-term, I suppose, political needs as well, to sort of a quick, I won't say quick wins, but being seen to sort of be acting on things and starting to push things forward much quicker. And that then counters against sort of the thinking, as you say, the need for perhaps complete rethink. I mean, where do you stand? Do you think that we just need to really kind of reset and actually have a whole, whatever country we're in, have a whole raft of new policy ideas coming forward, rather than, as you say, re-engineering existing policies?
Yes, because I think this is an unprecedented crisis, and I do not mean the COVID crisis, but the climate crisis. Then this really needs deep structural change in industries we depend on so much. So people might not like chemical companies or steel companies. Good luck going without them. You're not going to buy anything, use anything. It's in everything we have. So we need to have a dematerialization of the economy somehow. But also a change of materials that we use. Innovation in that direction is so complex that takes a lot of time. So it needs to have very ambitious goals of how you want to get there, but it's not impossible. If you look just now at the relative success of electric cars now over the past 5 years, the fact that the UK government said we're going to ban the sales of petrol and diesel cars really helps there, because that gives clarity. Then the car companies know there is no other way. We have to come up with producing the new product. And then they are on a massive scale now, because there is no other way. So sometimes you have to put business in a position that there is no other choice. This is what we need to do. But that needs bold policy. And this is what we'll see the coming years. A lot of the policies needed for climate change means that we can't do this, we can't do that. We're no longer allowed to do it by this. We can't. And politically, that's very sensitive, because it might mean that people lose their jobs because they're employed by industries that depend on fossil fuels. And if they disappear because of this transition, then they're not going to be happy. So that is also an issue here in the North, for example. Is this going to help leveling up? Maybe not, because actually in industry is more in the North. So if industry is going to disappear because of a transition to net zero, then it will do the opposite of leveling up. And that makes it so complex.
I was struck by your point, actually, when you, in your introduction there, about, what are you trying to push? You asked the question, and is it jobs? So for instance, with the housing you mentioned there, it was seen as quite attractive because it would involve a lot of labor to sort of push these reforms through, or these policies. And there's a fundamental question there, isn't there? Is it, if it's been driven by jobs, does actually that run against what we're trying to do in terms of decarbonize, or could it?
You always have to make certain trade-offs. What I've seen, and this is what I've studied by focusing on business, has been the so-called win-win rhetoric. I do something for the environment and I make money with it. Isn't it great? We're all happy. It's a bit what you see in policy as well. You try to kind of kill several birds with one stone, but that is, of course, great in how you package it and how you talk about it, but in practice it's very often not that easy, because we claim that the green sector will create all kinds of jobs, and in certain sectors that will be the case, but we need a lot of research to show if that is actually the case. It depends on how you do the greening. If greening goes via automation of processes, you need fewer people, and then you have fewer jobs. On the other hand, the jobs that you have might be of higher quality, and that helps the whole productivity debate. So it is always linked to that. So you can't just say, I need to do net zero, I only need policies thinking about the environment. I understand that. You also need to think about the consequences for the economy and for jobs and so forth. But it is a little bit how you're going to make those trade-offs. And I feel that too often the jobs agenda has been seen as much more important than the climate agenda. So indeed, also in finding solutions, you look for those solutions that create the most jobs, while it might actually not be a very good solution. And if that's the case, then you have to reconsider, is this actually what we need to do, what we want to do? Is this really going to be a solution? But there are a lot of uncertainties there.
Yeah, so this is obviously very relevant when we talked about leveling up. Precisely these questions and debates, I'm sure being had right now in the corridors of power.
Yeah, but this is where you need to do your research and try to figure out what is actually happening, because very often we assume that, if we put money there, then that will lead to leveling up and it will lead to green and it all works by itself. Well, an economy is a very complex system. So the moment you do something, it will have a lot of unintended consequences as well, which might completely derail what you wanted to do in the first place. It's not that easy. And this is why some of my colleagues do work on policy mixes, that you look at all the different policies and what they're doing and how they interact. Because in their interaction, it might actually lead to perverse incentives and companies not doing at all what you wanted them to do, or people not doing at all what you wanted them to do, for these kind of interactions that you never thought about. And when we talk about climate change, that has always been the issue between climate policy and energy policy. Very often when we talk about energy policy now, we think that is the same as climate policy or the other way around, but it's not necessarily the case. With energy, we also think about, okay, what type of energy, who do we depend on? Should we depend more on Russia, yes or no? Now we might say, well, maybe we want to depend more on Russia because that can bring the gas price down. On the other hand, people say, no, this is partly why the gas price is so high, because we depend on outside sources of fuel. So we need to push for renewables. So it's all linked somehow. And this is where you then need to make choices. Okay, for now, if we think climate change is really that important, you really need to push for climate change and not just see it as a side effect of energy policy.
It was also interesting, given that you compared UK with France and Germany, and I'm sort of thinking now about COP and obviously all those meetings that are going to take place next month between France, Germany, UK and others. To what extent, I mean, do you think they're talking to each other about their own different paths they're taking, or is it, for instance, the case the EU is taking a particular path, direction, and etc.? You know, how's that sort of do you think progressing? I mean, are they having those conversations right now about how each of their own green recoveries looks like? Are they trying to share best practice? What's your feeling there?
Well, Brexit is not that long ago. So the UK and the EU are quite on the same page in what they want to do, what they want to achieve with climate change and so forth. And UK did not say, oh, we had Brexit and now we're going to leave behind the climate agenda. Quite the opposite. The UK has always been a leading country in the EU in pushing for climate change mitigation. That is not changing. And the fact that the COP is in Glasgow really helps as well, because the symbolic nature of that should not be underestimated. That is very, very important. And this is why Boris Johnson was talking to the Prime Minister of India recently about exactly, okay, what is your country going to do? Where it becomes trickier is what is actually being discussed at the COP, because a lot of this is now going to be about the money. It's who's going to pay for what. And a lot of it is also about who's going to pay for helping developing countries get greener and so forth. And this is where you then see, oh, but then the UK is not part of the EU anymore. And well, we've had a recent history of fighting over money quite a lot between the EU and the UK. So these things might pop up there. And the recent track record of the UK in showing how much money is being put into helping developing countries. It's not a very good track record. So a lot of money has been taken out of things like the Newton Fund and so forth. So we have to see what the actual negotiations are being about, because it's no longer about this is the target, how we should reduce our emissions. It's a lot more about who's going to pay the bill for the different parts of meeting that target. And the moment it's about the money, yeah, it will be very, very difficult for them to actually agree, because then you get the endless discussion, rightly so, who is actually responsible for where we are right now. And in a country like India, I would say, yeah, we have recent industrialization, but looking back, hey, UK, you started the Industrial Revolution, so you go back quite a long way in already causing this.
And wait, it's interesting that you also looked at France and Germany for that study, because what's your take on, are they sort of waiting for as well more direction from the EU, or are they just pressing on with this? And what are other countries perhaps on the continent doing at the moment? What's your feeling?
Yeah, so no, they're definitely pressing as well. So for Germany, the green recovery was a lot about trying to rethink their industrial economy, where the UK is a service economy. Germany is really still an industrial economy. So they have a big car industry that needs to have a push. They have a big chemical industry that needs to change. And for them, it's all about their position in the global economy then. They are competing with Chinese companies, with Brazilian companies. And actually, if they are managing faster to green their industries, that would potentially lead to a competitive advantage in the export market for them. So export is super important for Germany because of that. And that's where they try to push. In France, it was a bit of a different story because there it may be similar to leveling up, but it was also seen as a way to push and help specific regions, because France is very similar like the UK, that everything is in the capital, basically. When we talk about the north-south divide here, I used to live in southern France, and there Paris was also a very long distance, and everything is being decided in Paris, and everything seems to be for Paris. So you have a lot of the similar kind of debates there that, well, you need to use recovery money, for example, to help also the regions that are struggling more. Germany doesn't have that in the same way, because Germany, for all kinds of political reasons, doesn't have one central hub. You have several hubs because of the split previously. You have, of course, East Germany, which is also still not as wealthy as West Germany or South Germany. But the debate is a little bit different. But in the end, a lot of the EU countries also look at the EU, what they're pushing in their Green Deal, and also as part of the recovery, because part of the money was allocated via EU mechanisms. So then it was just a matter of national countries making sure that their plan aligns well enough with the EU, so they could get more of that money, basically, because they were just fighting for the money on the EU level. And that is a fight the UK is no longer part of. So they don't have to necessarily do exactly what they say in Brussels.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's move on to the sort of sectors you were looking at. And just before I do, please do put some questions in. We'll happily ask them to Jonathan. So do put your question into chat or Q&A, and we'll ask it. You talked about those 4 different areas that the governments are on the whole looking at. So we had hydrogen, mobility, housing, and railways you mentioned. Let's take hydrogen, because hydrogen's there's a lot of excitement around hydrogen at the moment. An awful lot of money seems to be being raised by various people across the world into hundreds of different projects. Are you excited by hydrogen? And do you think it's a particularly good way of spending that money at the moment, or good share of it?
Yes, I am excited by hydrogen, although you have to be very careful always by choosing one type of technology and hoping that it will save the world. And that is a little bit what's happening with hydrogen now. I have the book is at home, but anyway, I have books in my bookcase of the hype of hydrogen, and those were published in 2005 or something like that, because we've been there before. Yeah. But there's a fundamental difference. When we talked about the hype of hydrogen 10, 15 years ago, that was hydrogen mostly used in fuel cells for mobility. So the fight was between, should it be an electric car or should it be a fuel cell vehicle? And that was the main kind of application. That has changed now, clearly partly because of Tesla, I guess. It has moved on. Electric vehicles are winning this race as a low emission vehicle, whether you like it or not. That's just how it now has become the dominant form. But now hydrogen is being seen as a solution for big industry. And they are really now spending a lot of money in trying to see how can we actually do steel production by relying on hydrogen. And so that is quite exciting. But you have to realize hydrogen is just a carrier of energy. It's not an energy source. And this is why you have the things like green, blue, gray hydrogen. In the end, it should be about green hydrogen. So that is basically splitting water with electrolysis and use renewable energy, electricity, to do that. So you need a windmill to get the electricity to be able to have this process. And Germany and France were deliberately spending money in their recovery packages on pushing this green hydrogen. The UK was way more ambiguous. They also want to do more blue hydrogen. Basically, you still use natural gas to produce the hydrogen. That creates greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, and they want to capture those and put them under the ground. So they link it to CCS or CCUS, carbon capture and storage. And that is being criticized because this is to some extent then becoming support for the industries fossil fuel industry, which is causing the problem. So you're not really then greening the whole system. And there is still a lot of carbon leakage also in the whole process of CCS. It's not as if it leads to 100% CO2 underground. So in that sense, hydrogen has to be looked at very critically. What type of hydrogen? So the colors that people say, all these colors, that makes it so technical. Well, these colors are really important because it's just a very different technology underlying it with huge consequences for climate change.
And on the point, hydrogen is a good example actually of a wider question, which a lot of these sessions this week that we've been running as part of this festival have actually come up with the same question, which is who takes the lead? And I think hydrogen is a particularly good example of that, isn't it? Because it's, as you say, it's multifaceted. There's many different elements to it, many different potential uses of it as well. That's a big question, isn't it, Jonatan? Who would take the lead on that? I mean, do you see any evidence in the UK that the right sort of conversations are being had, the right sort of, where are we with that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the following. It's quite tricky. This is again what the government wants. A government wants to have hydrogen as part of the economy, but also that the hydrogen is preferably being developed and produced within the borders of the country. But it's really difficult to create policy where you get a higher uptake of hydrogen and also homegrown hydrogen. Let's call it like that, because this is where we've been before. In Germany, for example, back in the day, they had a feed-in tariff. The feed-in tariff was a subsidy for electricity produced by solar panels, and you got money for feeding your electricity back into the grid. That was very successful because for a period of 20 years, you knew you were going to make money with your solar panels. So people were investing in it big time. That led indeed to a large uptake of solar electricity in Germany. But at the same time, they wanted to have a solar industry. And that worked. You had companies like Q-Cells, really successful. So you got this local solar industry. And see, the policy is great. And then came China. Basically, the Chinese industry also saw, hey, there's a guaranteed market for solar in Germany with a good payoff. We're just going to produce these solar panels because we know that there's a market for it. And they did that very successfully, large scale, brought down the price. So for solar energy, it has been an absolute blessing. For the German solar industry, it has been a curse because they couldn't compete with the Chinese. They all went bankrupt or were acquired, or it all disappeared. China only later on started also producing solar for their own country. It was first for the foreign country. So it can be that the UK comes up with policies that really help the deployment of hydrogen in local industry, but it might not be the case that the actual technologies and the whole industry making the hydrogen is going to be based in the UK. But from a climate change perspective, we would say that doesn't matter. Because if we need the hydrogen to green our hard to decarbonize sectors, that's the most important thing. An economist says, it doesn't matter where it is done, where it's produced, as long as it's done in the most efficient way. We still have trade. It's not as if trade has disappeared. But that will become a tricky thing, because if you look at all these countries, they all want to become leader in hydrogen. Well, we know one thing, you can't all be leader. Only a few or one can win. But this is why they are betting then on different type of technologies, different types of how do you produce it, what kind of fuel cell might you have, and so forth. So, and then you really go more into the fine grained analysis, and you say, well, you can be a leader in this specific niche of that market, and that can be very successful. But the moment you'll talk about a fairly simple way of producing hydrogen, then probably the Chinese are going to win out, because they've proven that they will win with all these processes.
I mean, I know that in the UK, I think the Humber area is really quite an area of activity in this, and I think Rotterdam on the continent is another area which is a lot going on. So, but it'd be interesting to see how that develops in months and years to come. Let's take some questions now. We've got plenty coming in. I'm going to ask questions, if that's okay, on behalf of the people who've kindly put them forward. Oshi is sent us a very good question here. In terms of policy interventions for a green recovery, is there a policy mix in place, i.e. even UK or elsewhere, i.e. a mixture of regulations, procurement, research grants, subsidies that are coherent such that they work together so to achieve green recovery? So is there a policy mix in place?
Ooh, that's I have a PhD student also working on policy mixes who might be on the call. I don't know. I've not looked at participants. The thing is, policy mixes are hardly ever beautifully designed, and that you put all the different policies in place at one point in time that it nicely works together. So a lot of it is ad hoc decision making, and the moment that happens, you could argue, looking back, oh, there was a policy mix, but the interactions between the different policies might not have been optimal, to say the least. If you look at the speed by which certain policies were being pushed through with the green recovery, you know already that it's going to lead to a lot of unintended consequences, because there's no way that they've done all their beautiful analysis, looking at all kind of potential outcomes and consequences and how things would interact and so forth. So the moment you're speeding up things, it sounds great, but yeah, it's not always going to work that way. They are discussing a lot of these things. I mean, I am part of working groups with BASE, and they do look at all kinds of policies to also really help the demand side, so that we get a lot of kind of demand for low carbon products. So the government, UK government, is very much aware that that needs to happen as well. That it's not just going to be pushing some technologies, but you need to create a market for low carbon products. But that is a process that takes time, because if you put in some kind of standard without thinking about what it might do, then it's only going to be a failure, and then you have to scrap the standard again after 6 months, and you don't want to do that. So that certain things take a little bit more time here, that's understandable. But yeah, we still have to see how it all works together, and it will not be a beautiful policy mix which does everything for everyone and we're all happy. I just don't believe that's possible.
Yeah, that's a very tough question to ask you there. You did a very sterling job at trying to answer it. We've got a question from Dominic. He's saying, I felt that focusing solely on climate change and carbon emissions is a misnomer, considering the critical state of the living world we're in, and how many critical planetary thresholds we've pushed. He says, given the difficulties of even getting policies involved just to cut carbon, do you think it's realistic to expect similar action to happen to address these other ecological crises?
That's an excellent question. I actually share this concern. I wrote a book in, what was it, 2008, 2009, on climate change. And actually we say in our conclusion, like, it's great that we talk about climate change, but it's also crowding out a lot of other very important environmental issues that we talk about less, because also NGOs have figured out that people are willing to listen when it's about climate, and then everything environmental becomes climate, as if every issue is climate change, and that's not the case. Climate change will have a lot of influence on a lot of other environmental issues like biodiversity, but it will be more difficult at times. Part of the success of the climate change agenda was it's linked to energy, so you can create this business case, this win-win. Because how do you reduce your carbon emissions? Well, you reduce your energy use. Energy costs money. So if you have less money to be spent on energy, that's a win. It's great. If you are trying to produce something in a specific location where there's some kind of rare frog who lives there, and you're now not allowed to use that to produce whatever you want to produce, you're not going to like it so much. And then most people will say, can't do this, can't do that, I don't like it. In my own country, where I'm from, the Netherlands, there's been a big debate about nitrogen. Because of the nitrogen, there was too much nitrogen in the environment. So then they suddenly had to shut down all kinds of building projects. They had to stop driving very fast. They had to go really slow. People hated it. Why? Because they had no clue what nitrogen does. And they only see what they can no longer do. And so big protests, farmers putting their big tractors into The Hague and so forth. So you will see that more and more, that if the sustainability issue is a bit more abstract and it's unclear how we people benefit from it, it will be much more difficult to sell. And this is why a lot of these planetary boundaries it's already way in the red, because people just don't see why this is important, yes or no. And this is partly what the environmental movement has always been doing. They try to frame the debate in a way that we people care. So we were afraid of the hole in the ozone layer because it would give you skin cancer. And that is then one of the main things where we say, oh, we need to do something about that. And well, we can go without spray cans so we don't have skin cancer. That's kind of a fairly simple one after the other. But with a lot of other things, it is very, very difficult. And especially when it is about destroying nature, we still have a high willingness to say, well, let's get rid of some nature there. We'll just plant a few trees there and then the problem is solved. And it's like, yeah, but you killed a lot of things there that are not all of a sudden popping up there. New things will pop up, but it becomes a very difficult debate. So yeah, the other thing is with climate change itself, the impacts are felt more and more. What are we going to do about that? Because we can, of course, say we're going to beat this. Yeah, probably not all the way. So you have to come to the conclusion, and in the policy circles, they already came to that conclusion a long time ago, that you also need to talk about adaptation. You can't just talk about mitigation. And the longer you postpone that, the more the impacts will be on society.
It certainly seems to me, as a casual observer, that issue about adaptation is now getting far more traction and more people are aware of it, aren't they? Only yesterday we had the Environment Agency here do sort of quite a hard-hitting report, didn't it, saying that the UK just wasn't ready for things like the flooding in Germany we saw this summer, that those sort of catastrophic events, and how, is the UK ready? It was saying no. There's lots we can do, and just one example of that, indeed. Let's take another question. A very good one from Molly, who's saying, do you think wide-scale social and political reforms are required to achieve a true green recovery to tackle the climate crisis within these tight timescales we're facing? So I think this is this point we've already talked about, the timescales involved here, and actually being able to, produce policies, reforms which actually can gain results in the very short time frame we have.
Probably the answer is yes, but will you manage to get there? So we can come up with all kinds of beautiful analysis of what it should look like. And this is what we do also when we do research on policy making and so forth. But you have to realize that in the end, it is being decided by politics, by politicians. So in the end, what is being pushed through is also where the politicians feel there is enough kind of social acceptance of doing this. And that has come under severe pressure, of course, now in times of COVID. We've seen an intervening government in a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. On the other hand, it goes with a lot of protest as well. And in the field of climate change, that has happened already in France. The Yellow Vest movement was related to the price of petrol So it's not unimaginable. I think, and this is what it makes it interesting, is you see now also right-wing governments talking and trying to do something about climate change. So it is no longer a left versus right per se. How far they're willing to go and in what way, there will be a lot of differences there. But at least climate change itself has become now so important that there is now a broad willingness across the political field to do major interventions in the economy. Will it be enough? We'll see, because if you look at global emissions, they're not going down, they're going up.
Okay. Another question from Louis. He's saying, what are the key things to look out for at COP? Something we've already perhaps touched on a little bit before, Jonatan. Are there any simple success/failure outcomes to look out for? Or will it be impossible to tell without delving into the details? So this is that's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, beyond the sort of the headlines we get each day from the conference, yeah, what's really going on in the background? Yeah.
So basically, this is COP 26. So being excited about a COP is a bit of a funny thing, because they basically happen every year. Now it was 2 years, a bit like the James Bond. It got postponed, so we're more excited. A lot of it is, let's call it boring details, but important boring details, but are very difficult for people to see. Oh, wow, this is how it has been dealt with. You really have to go then into what is actually happening here and there. The moment a COP like in Paris is grabbing the attention is when there is an agreement, okay, this is the percentage, how much we're going to bring it down, and this is what we commit to, and so forth. So COP will be important when some big countries sign up to this is what we're going to do. But this is not really going to be that COP per se for that. A lot of it is more about how we're actually going to implement it, who's going to pay for what, how does it all work, and so forth. And those are then the boring details, but the COP can be very successful if they figure out mechanisms to get different parts of the global economy to take their fair share. Because 10 years ago, it was basically, well, the US and China won't do anything. India probably not either. So it was just the EU trying to show some kind of leadership while the rest of the world is not willing to go anywhere. That has changed now, but it's still the case. Okay, how far is China willing to go? And what is our responsibility in it as well? Because it's easy to blame China, but they're producing what we're buying via Amazon. So a lot of European countries have pushed their industry out, offshored it, and feel that they're no longer having responsibility for the emissions. Well, technically, you are responsible because you are profiting from the supply chains, the global supply chains that cause these. So I usually do not have very high expectations from COPs. I remember the biggest excitement back in the day we had with Copenhagen, because Copenhagen should do it all, and then nothing really happens. I have to say with Paris, I had no expectations, and okay, hey, wow, people were willing to sign up to something. But we can endlessly go with the hype show around the COP. In the end, it is really now, how is it being translated into national action as well? We can have all kinds of agreements, but then you get global agreements, but you get a new election in a country, and then you get a populist who comes into power and says, oh, we have the Paris Agreement. No, I pull out of the Paris Agreement. And these things have happened again and again. So what is it that's going to be concretely happening in the specific countries? And being a leader, even though you think that the rest of the world is not doing something, is still a good thing, because things are moving.
I mean, I suppose the point you touch on there is this danger, if you like, that each country goes off in its own different direction. Or is that a good thing, bad thing? I don't know, in terms of how they translate it to national action, as you say. But the value of COP, I guess, is that, you know, there are the cross-border discussions, you know, to sort of frame sort of broader. Okay, Paris obviously was, I think, because of the figures that came out, actual targets, people remember that, don't they? As you say, this one could be far more about structure mechanisms, the boring stuff, want a better word.
If I look at the latest IPCC report, for example, we didn't talk about it so much. That was quite short-lived, because it basically just reiterated what we knew already. And yeah, so you do get a little bit of a fatigue with people saying, okay, yeah, I know.
Yeah. We nearly almost, our hour's almost up, Jonathan. I'm just going to ask you a couple of final things. And if you've anyone's got a question from the audience, there's time still to ask it to you. It was really just going back to that paper you wrote, we talked about at the beginning, and some of the key lessons from it. I think one of the really interesting sort of takeaways from it when I read it was that you talked about the importance of designing policies that include an ambitious strategy, but also got necessary implementation mechanisms for effective delivery. And that, to me, sums up kind of what we've been talking about last hour, really.
Yes.
You know, how important it is that, okay, you have, you know, effective policies, but you have the infrastructure around it to deliver it. I'm presuming you're going to be doing much more work around this. I guess this paper will lead to many other
well, that's the idea.
More research. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What we want to understand, for example, is now, okay, what is the next step? If companies, they all set their net zero targets now. That is not yet a legal obligation. Will that become a legal obligation? Let's see. But then, what will be the plans? What will they be doing? And one of the questions that we'll start having from a productivity perspective, for example, the moment we start greening our economy and let's hope upgrading our economy, will it also improve productivity? Will it lead to better jobs? What will be the consequences? Because you only get a major buy-in the end into all this agenda if people feel like it's really helping them all in what they want to achieve. So follow-up research is really okay. If steel companies are going for hydrogen, how long will it take? What will it mean? Can they do that? What will be the productivity consequences? Are there short-term problems because there will be huge costs? How is government willing to pay part of that bill? Because the moment you start doing your R&D for developing new production processes based on hydrogen, companies might have the money, but they're not willing to spend all their money on that because they also want to give some money back to their shareholders. So that's always the fine balance. But still, a lot of this R&D will happen inside companies, but it will not only happen inside companies. A lot of it is linked with public money for R&D. So that will be the big question. How much is it going really in innovation? Is it always innovation that is needed, or is it maybe sometimes more deployment that is needed? Because we also have the tendency to hope for the silver bullet solution. Well, it might just be that you have to scale up a few existing technologies that are already out there, are proven. And that is a very old debate in the field of sustainability. If you are trying or hoping too much that technology will save you, at some point it also means that you just should stop doing certain things. If it's just too polluting, just don't do it, even though you enjoy it so much. It's a bit like smoking. That will become a tricky issue.
Okay, just got time for very quickly one final question there, Jonatan, was what role do you think improvements in sustainability reporting within the private sector can have?
Yes, so very important. So too much of that is voluntary. And I studied the sustainability reports for a project years ago. When did we publish it? 2007 or something like that, for KPMG. So KPMG wanted to know the state of sustainability reports. So back then I read more sustainability reports than I want to, because it was quite boring at times, because clearly there were no clear rules about it. So American companies would come up with some beautiful pictures, not a lot of detail. Japanese companies would have clearly all the same consultant doing it, but really with all kinds of numbers. They loved the numbers, and the Europeans were a bit in between. But it was all over the place, and a lot of it was not very concrete. The more and more there are clear rules for how you report on sustainability, like we have for financial accounting, the more it becomes possible for the investment community to say, hey, this company is actually doing a good job, this company is not doing a good job. And so it will start driving decisions from the so-called ESG movement, environment, social, and governance. So those investors that want to think about society and the planet, where they are going to put their money. Pension funds should put their money then in certain companies and not in other companies, and so forth. All of these decisions depend on reliable information, and sustainability reporting is the core of that. And I think for too long, companies have gotten away with a beautiful glossing over of the things that they're doing. You have one little project and you put it central as if your whole company is doing fantastic things. I think it needs to become part of legislation, that they need to have a clear report on all kinds of sustainability impacts, that it's all being measured according to specific standards. Those are agreed, that the auditors know how it works, that they can check the whole thing, and so forth. And the companies like KPMG would love that, because that means more business for them. There was a reason why they back in the day paid for that project. But I think it's a crucial part.
In fact, that's an area we'll be looking at this afternoon, another session for this festival, 2:00, with Paolo Quattrone, a professor here at the school. He'll be talking about these sort of very issues. So thank you to Mohammed for that question, just put in there. Our time is up. I want to thank all our people listening who put in questions. Really appreciate you putting in questions, Jonatan. Really appreciate that. Thank you for listening and viewing. I hope you've enjoyed the hour and hope you've taken away some learnings from it. I really want to thank Jonatan for his time today, for taking time out of his very busy diary to talk to us and to debate these issues. And I think there's been plenty to think about and talk about. So thank you, Jonatan, from myself. And yes, and do keep in tune for the other events throughout the week at the festival. Thank you.
Thank you.